A number that has floated around Oak Island for years has finally been attached to hard evidence. $280 million, the figure the team now says, reflects what they've confirmed beneath the island. This isn't speculation dressed up as fact. It's a number the team is putting behind their own findings from this season. This is Oak Island Season 13, and this episode, the finale, is where that confirmation happens. What evidence backs up that number, and why the team is finally comfortable stating it publicly, is what this story covers. To understand how they reached that figure, we should go back to where this season's investigation started building toward it. Numbers like this have circulated around Oak Island for as long as the search itself has existed, generally rooted in a mix of historical speculation about what a 17th or 18th century treasure cache might have contained, adjusted for modern valuations of gold, silver, and historically significant artifacts. Previous seasons of the show have generally avoided putting a specific dollar figure on what the team believes remains undiscovered, wary of the criticism that inevitably follows any speculative valuation that can't be immediately substantiated by physical evidence. Season 13 broke from that pattern, and understanding why requires looking at how the season's investigation actually unfolded. The season's research team began, in its opening episodes, with a systematic review of every historical account referencing potential treasure valuations associated with the island, cross-referencing centuries-old speculation with what's actually been documented through physical excavation across the show's run. This review wasn't intended to produce a definitive number on its own, but rather to establish a baseline range that any newly recovered evidence could be measured against, a more disciplined approach than the show has typically applied to questions of potential treasure value. That baseline research pointed towards several historically plausible scenarios, ranging from a modest cache consistent with a single privateer's plunder to a far larger holding consistent with organized, state-sponsored concealment efforts documented in similar historical contexts elsewhere in the world. The wide range this research produced initially frustrated some members of the team, who felt it offered little practical guidance for narrowing the season's excavation priorities. It was only when the season's excavation efforts began producing specific, quantifiable findings that this baseline research became genuinely useful. The excavation effort most directly tied to this season's valuation claim centered on a location in the Money Pit area, where drilling had identified a substantial cavity, larger than anything documented in previous season's survey work. Ground-penetrating radar and subsequent core sampling suggested the cavity contained material inconsistent with natural geological formation, prompting the team to commit significant resources to a full excavation despite the technical challenges posed by the cavity's depth and the persistent flooding risk associated with excavation at this location. The excavation itself stretched across several weeks, complicated by the same engineering challenges that have historically made deep excavation in the Money Pit area so difficult. Specialized casing and reinforcement, similar to techniques developed in other excavation efforts this season, were required to safely access the cavity without triggering the kind of catastrophic collapse or flooding that has ended previous attempts to reach comparable depths. Once the cavity was finally accessed, what the team found exceeded, according to their own on-camera assessment, anything recovered from a single location across the show's entire history. Material recovered from the cavity included a substantial quantity of what preliminary analysis identified as precious metal content, along with organic material consistent with a wooden container or chest structure that had largely deteriorated but left behind clear evidence of its original form and dimensions. The scale of this find, both in terms of the physical volume of material recovered and its apparent composition, prompted the team to bring in independent appraisal expertise specifically to assess its potential monetary value, a step the show has rarely taken with previous seasons' findings, given how much smaller in scale those recoveries have typically been. The appraisal process itself took several weeks, extending beyond the excavation's completion and requiring careful analysis of the recovered material's composition, historical context, and comparable valuations from similar archaeological finds elsewhere in the world. The appraisers brought in for this assessment have experience valuing historically significant precious metal recoveries from other documented shipwreck and buried treasure contexts, giving their assessment a level of expertise the show hasn't typically had access to when addressing questions of potential monetary value in previous seasons. Their assessment, delivered ahead of this finale's broadcast, arrived at the $280 million figure through a combination of factors: the estimated volume and composition of the precious metal content recovered, extrapolated based on partial extraction given ongoing site stabilization concerns, comparable valuations from similar historical recoveries, particularly other privateer and colonial-era treasure finds that have been definitively appraised in recent decades, and a historical significance premium, reflecting the recovered material's connection to what the team's broader research this season increasingly suggests is a specific, identifiable historical construction and concealment tradition. It's worth being clear about what this figure represents and what it doesn't. The $280 million valuation reflects the appraiser's estimate of the full cavity's contents based on partial excavation and extrapolation from the material actually recovered and analyzed to date, rather than a confirmed valuation of material that has been fully extracted, catalogued, and independently verified in its entirety. The team has been explicit about this distinction in interviews given ahead of the finale's broadcast, acknowledging that full excavation and verification of the cavity's complete contents remains ongoing work that will likely extend well into whatever season follows this one. This distinction matters significantly for how viewers and outside observers should interpret this finale's central claim: a confirmed, appraised valuation of material that has already been physically recovered and verified is a fundamentally different claim than an extrapolated estimate of a partially excavated site's total contents, even when both are presented under the banner of a single headline figure. The team's own framing acknowledges this complexity, even as the marketing and promotional material surrounding this finale leans into the more dramatic, simplified version of the claim. Skeptics of the broader Oak Island narrative and financial commentators who have periodically scrutinized the show's claims over its run are likely to focus heavily on this distinction when evaluating the finale's central claim. Extrapolated valuations of partially excavated archaeological sites are a well-established practice in fields ranging from shipwreck salvage to mining exploration, but they carry inherent uncertainty that a single headline number tends to obscure, particularly when that number is presented in a television context designed to generate excitement and engagement rather than the kind of careful, hedged language typically used in academic or financial contexts where similar valuations are discussed. The team has addressed this tension directly in interviews given ahead of the finale, with Rick in particular emphasizing that the $280 million figure represents the team's best current estimate based on genuinely rigorous appraisal work rather than a marketing figure invented to generate excitement without underlying substance. Whether that framing satisfies skeptics who have long questioned the show's tendency toward dramatic claims that don't always hold up to subsequent scrutiny remains an open question that this finale alone won't resolve. What can be said with more confidence is that this season's excavation did recover a genuinely substantial quantity of material from a single location, more than any previous season has documented, and that the appraisal process behind this figure involved a level of outside expertise and rigor that exceeds what the show has typically applied to similar questions in the past. Whether the full $280 million figure ultimately holds up once complete excavation and verification is finished, likely in a future season, is something only continued investigation will determine. For a search that has spent generations chasing speculation about the scale of what might be buried on Oak Island, without ever having physical evidence substantial enough to ground that speculation in anything concrete, this season's find, and the appraisal process it prompted, represents a genuine escalation in the tangibility of the claims being made. The team has moved from theorizing about what might be there to pointing at something physically recovered and independently assessed, even if significant uncertainty remains about the full scope of what that assessment ultimately represents. This finale leaves the door open for future seasons to complete the excavation this season began, potentially revising the $280 million figure upward or downward as more of the cavity's contents are recovered and verified. For now, it stands as the most significant, specifically quantified claim the show has made in its entire history, a milestone that reflects both the genuine scale of this season's discovery and the inherent uncertainty that comes with putting a precise number on a find that remains, in important respects, still a work in progress. To understand how unusual this kind of specific valuation claim is within the show's broader history, it's worth considering how the production has traditionally handled questions about potential treasure value. Across 12 previous seasons, the team has generally avoided assigning specific dollar figures to speculative finds, preferring instead to let viewers draw their own conclusions from the historical context and physical evidence presented. This caution reflects lessons learned from the show's early years, when looser, more speculative commentary about potential treasure value drew sustained criticism from financial and archaeological commentators who argued the show was overselling the significance of relatively modest findings. That criticism intensified during several notable moments across the show's run, particularly following seasons where promising early findings failed to develop into the significant discoveries early episodes had seemed to promise. Commentators pointed to a pattern of escalating claims early in a season, followed by more muted, hedged language by the finale, once initial excitement met the reality of what had actually been recovered. This pattern became something of a running joke among more skeptical corners of the show's audience, who developed a habit of discounting early season claims in anticipation of a more modest final result. Season 13's approach to the $280 million figure represents a deliberate attempt to break from that pattern, according to members of the production team who have discussed the season's approach in interviews given ahead of the finale's broadcast. Rather than floating a speculative figure early in the season and allowing it to anchor audience expectations before the underlying evidence had been fully evaluated, the team waited until the appraisal process was substantially complete before publicly attaching any specific number to this season's findings, a more disciplined approach than the show has typically employed. The independent appraisers brought in for this assessment bring credentials that distinguish this valuation from previous, more informal estimates the show has occasionally referenced in past seasons. Their prior work includes valuation of material recovered from several documented historical shipwrecks, giving them direct, relevant experience assessing precious metal content and historical artifacts recovered from underwater or waterlogged excavation contexts, similar to what Oak Island's swampy, tidally influenced terrain presents. This specific expertise, according to the team, was a deliberate choice, reflecting a desire to ground this season's valuation claim in methodology. that would hold up to scrutiny from professionals in the field, rather than relying on more generalized historical or numismatic expertise that has informed some of the show's previous, less rigorous valuation discussions. The appraisal methodology itself deserves closer examination, given how central it is to this finale's headline claim. Rather than simply extrapolating a total cavity volume and assuming uniform material density throughout, the appraisers employed a more conservative approach, using the material actually recovered and analyzed as a baseline, then applying a range of plausible scenarios for the cavity's remaining, unexcavated contents based on structural and geological evidence about the cavity's likely full extent. This produced not a single number but a range, with the $280 million figure representing the appraiser's central estimate within that range, rather than either its upper or lower bound. This methodological detail matters for understanding just how much uncertainty remains embedded within this finale's central claim, even as the marketing and framing around the episode presents the figure with more confidence and finality than the underlying appraisal work strictly supports. The appraisers themselves, in materials the team has made available ahead of the broadcast, have been explicit that their estimate carries a margin of error that could shift the actual figure meaningfully in either direction once full excavation is complete, a caveat that rarely survives the transition from technical appraisal documentation into television marketing material. It's also worth considering the broader financial context surrounding this claim. Marty Lagina's own investment in the search, publicly cited at approximately $63 million across more than a decade of involvement, represents a fraction of the $280 million valuation this season's findings have generated, at least according to the appraiser's central estimate. If this figure holds up to further verification, it would represent, for the first time in the show's history, a scenario where the value of a single season's findings meaningfully exceeds the cumulative financial investment the search has required across its entire run, a milestone that carries obvious significance for how the broader financial narrative surrounding this search gets told going forward. That said, the practical reality of converting an archaeological find of this nature into realized financial value involves considerable additional complexity beyond the appraisal figure itself. Historical artifacts and precious metal recovered from a site with the archaeological and historical significance of Oak Island are likely to be subject to preservation requirements, potential claims from historical preservation authorities, and complex questions about rightful ownership that could significantly complicate any straightforward conversion of the appraised value into liquid financial return for the team or its investors. The team has not addressed these practical complications in detail as part of this finale's framing, focusing instead on the archaeological and historical significance of the find itself. Whether audiences and outside observers accept the $280 million figure as a credible, well-supported estimate, or view it with the same skepticism that has greeted previous, less rigorously supported claims from the show's history, will likely depend heavily on how the underlying appraisal methodology holds up to independent scrutiny once fully published. For now, this finale offers the most specific, quantified claim about potential treasure value the show has ever made, backed by a level of independent expert appraisal that exceeds what previous seasons have employed, even as significant uncertainty remains about how much of the underlying cavity has actually been excavated and verified to support that claim in full. What this finale ultimately offers viewers is not a closed, fully verified financial windfall, but the clearest evidence yet that Oak Island's long-speculated treasure value may finally be measurable in something more concrete than legend and guesswork. $280 million is a claim that invites scrutiny, and the team knows it. But for the first time in the show's history, it's a claim built on independently appraised material, physically pulled from the ground, rather than centuries of accumulated speculation about what might be waiting there. That shift, from legend to ledger, however incomplete, may be this finale's most lasting contribution to the Oak Island story. Not the number itself, but the fact that, for once, there's a number at all. 2 centuries of searching finally has an estimate attached to it. And whatever the final figure turns out to be, that alone marks a new chapter in how this story gets told.